Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Tracy Woodruff. I'm a professor at the University of California, San Francisco. I run the program on reproductive health and the environment. I also have the honor of being the PI of a Children's Environmental Health Center grant, which is funded by US EPA and the National Institutes for Environmental Health Sciences. I'd like to thank you all for coming here today to talk about children, science, and the environment. And I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the University of California, San Francisco, and the Children's Environmental Health Network. And I'd like to also thank Senator Gillibrand, who helped us secure this lovely room for this briefing. And as a reminder, we are videotaping and live streaming during the event. So we're going to talk about why the environment matters for children's health and why it's important that we have a strong EPA to defend children's health from environmental threats. So it's well established that the environment can affect children's health through numerous different types of adverse health outcomes. All the health outcomes that you see linked up here, including ADHD, asthma, cancer, lower IQ, effects on birth outcomes like low birth weight and preterm birth, all have been linked to exposures to environmental contaminants. And we have a challenge because the use of industrial chemicals and the production of industrial chemicals has increased greatly since the 1950s, and now they're ubiquitous in all the different products we have in our daily lives. But they're also greatly used. This is data from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which talks about, it's from a report that they did in 2012 of an inventory of just industrial chemicals that are registered for use in the United States. And what this says is that 30,000 pounds of chemicals per person are registered for use or inventoried by the U.S. EPA in the United States. And this doesn't include air pollutants or pesticides. So what this means is that we're all exposed to environmental chemicals every day, everywhere, during all the different periods of our life, starting in utero and during pregnancy. This is why leading and health professional societies have been calling for action on understanding and addressing the impacts of chemicals on health, including the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, pediatric societies, and the Endocrine Society. We also know that EPA rules affect children's health because the decisions they make on the science influence exposures to us and to our children. So recently there was also a statement by a group of leading scientists and clinicians called the Tender Statement, which talked about that we know that there's enough science to show that environmental chemicals are impacting brain development and children's learning behaviors and IQ, which will be talked about more by the other speakers. And in addition, in this statement, they talked about a list of chemicals that we should be concerned about for their effects on children's brains, including organophosphate pesticides, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are flame retardants, particulate matter, air pollution, lead, which is well established, mercury, also well established, and polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, which while they have been banned, are still measured in people today because of their persistence in the environment. The other thing that's important to remember about environmental chemicals is that when EPA takes action on environmental chemicals, they can make significant reductions in exposures to pollutants. This is from a report that EPA did about the Clean Air Act, the amendments which were passed in 1990, showing that when EPA acted on the common air pollutants, right here, they have gone down over time because of EPA actions, while at the same time we have seen a growth in the economy as well as population. In addition, the reductions in air pollutants have led to $2 trillion in health benefits. So what this means is regulating these chemicals and reducing their impacts on our health are a win-win because we can see economic growth while at the same time improving the health of the population. And EPA, in their rulemakings, have a net benefit, a net health benefit over the costs, which have been, this is from reports that are done every year by the Office of Management and Budget, which looks across the federal agency to see what are the costs and benefits of regulations in the federal government. And you can see right here that the benefits in this green bar far outweigh the cost of major rulemakings. This includes rulemakings in air, water, and Superfund. EPA's mission is to protect human health, and they have the regulatory authority under the various legislations that have been enacted to do that. And they need to consider the populations that are most at risk. They are at risk because they're more vulnerable because they are developing, such as children and the fetus. They are more vulnerable because of where they live or where they work. And these populations are the ones that we will be talking about today in terms of their importance for thinking about how the environmental contaminants affect their health. Recently, we have seen actions by the administration to change the direction that EPA is going in terms of the regulations that they have been passed, that they have promulgated to influence the exposures that we have to different types of chemicals and pollutants in the environment. This has been noticed by other scientists in the field that have called out, and this is from the New England Journal of Medicine, saying that the Trump administration should pay attention to this science and to the health benefits of the environmental regulations to take action and to improve the health of the population. And with that, we are going to walk through some examples, and we have some leading scientists here who will, who will talk about the work that they've been doing and why the environment and the science shows that environmental regulating and dealing with policies to protect us from exposures to environmental chemicals matter for children's health. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Ricky Pereira, who is also a PI of a Children's Environmental Health Center at Columbia, and she's done many different things, but we'll talk about air pollution and effects on children's health.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, everyone. So I am going to talk about the health effects of fossil fuel-related emissions, health effects that particularly impact children because of their developmental vulnerability. And these sources include cars and trucks, power plants burning coal, oil, natural gas, and methane, which is and natural gas production, transportation, which releases methane. So all these are fossil fuel-related emissions. And you look at the numbers and the names on these air toxics, you recognize them. Particulate matter, hydrocarbons like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, mercury, sulfur, and nitrogen oxides, and volatile organic chemicals. And these are just some. And on the other hand, on the other side, we have emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, the two primary global altering greenhouse gases that are released by human activities, and that cause climate change and resulting in higher temperatures, extreme weather events, and natural disasters, spread of infectious agents, also rising sea level and flooding, ecosystem disruption, and social and political instability are among the impacts. But we shouldn't think of these in silos. We shouldn't think on the one hand of the air pollutants that are directly toxic or climate change and their impacts on children. We need to consider them jointly because they come from the same source and they interact. So for example, ozone, a very strong respiratory irritant and contributing to children's asthma exacerbations, is formed more rapidly from the precursors nitrogen oxides and volatile organic chemicals at elevated temperatures due to climate change. So there is a need for a holistic view here. And similarly with the health impacts of fossil fuel-related emissions, the air toxics are associated with preterm birth, infant mortality, low birth weight, allergies and asthma in children, also a variety of neurodevelopmental disorders and possibly cancer in children. On the other side, climate change has brought increases in undernutrition, infectious disease spread such as Zika or Lyme disease, for example, physical trauma from flooding, Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, mental ill health, asthma exacerbation, and heat-related illness. Now, here too, we need to think of these together because they do interact to heighten risks. The same children are often exposed to both impacts, both sorts of impacts. And for example, a child born preterm or low birth weight will be more vulnerable to undernutrition or infectious disease. A child who's suffering from asthma will have more problems from the exacerbations due to exposure to pollens and mold, which come along with climate change. So again, a holistic view is needed. Now in New York City, our center has conducted long-term studies enrolling women in pregnancy and following them and their children. We're now following children through their 18th year, 18th birthday. And on the top, you see that we monitor the exposure in the air that women are breathing during pregnancy using small backpack monitors. We also measure a fingerprint of exposure in cord blood and maternal blood collected at delivery, which is the interaction of the pollutants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, with DNA, literally latched on to DNA, leaving a fingerprint. And so we use that measurement as well. And those, we then follow the children, assessing their cognitive functioning and behavioral development. MRIs of the children's brains have been done, and also spirometry, lung function testing, and assessment of respiratory health. And we see links with reduced birth weight and head circumference, with developmental delay, reduced IQ, behavioral problems, including ADHD, and MRI brain changes, allergic sensitization and asthma, and obesity over the childhood years. Oh, I should point out that these data have been directly useful to policymaking in New York City and elsewhere. Mayor Bloomberg wrote us that our data had encouraged the policies during his administration to reduce air pollution in all 5 boroughs. And so these data are very policy relevant. And the estimated health costs are huge and represent the potential benefits of action to reduce these exposures. And as Tracy Woodruff has said, the health costs are in the billions of dollars a year. You can read these, over $4 billion due to preterm births attributable just to particulate air pollution. 6 billion plus from current effects of ozone, 300 to almost 900 billion due to fossil fuel electricity. And for only 6 climate change events over a 7-year period in the U.S., and a cost of $14 billion in health costs due to those events. And the $2 trillion in benefits attributed to the U.S. Clean Air Act amendments by 2020 is a staggering number. So we can do well by doing good. And the rollbacks of rules and policies that have been proposed will directly harm children's health. So cars and trucks emit vast quantities of air pollution and also are responsible for 20% of climate-altering emissions. The power plants burning coal, oil, natural gas are major sources of air pollution and responsible for 30% of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse-altering gases. And the natural gas production and transportation releases large quantities of methane, second most important greenhouse gas, and more potent in the short term than carbon dioxide. So you can see that rollbacks will mean less efficient cars, dirtier power plants, more methane emissions, more pollution, which is directly toxic, accelerated climate change, and more harm to children and to their future well-being. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Pereira. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Linda McCauley, who is the Dean of the Emory University Neil Hopkins Woodruff School of Nursing, no relationship to me. She also has a Children's Environmental Health Center and is a leading expert on pesticides and other contaminant effects on children's health and development.
Thank you, Tracy. So our first two speakers, I think, have given you a lot of the research, the science, the data in terms of why this meeting today is so important. And I want to take you on more of my personal journey as a nurse and a scientist and the work that I've done around pesticides and the value of science and the need to protect children's health. So I think we can all agree that pesticides are chemicals that have enabled in many ways the world to provide better food for soaring populations and to control deadly diseases spread by insects. And so the public health benefits of careful pesticide use have been well recognized, and I underline careful because I think that's what we're here for today to talk about. Pesticides can be dangerous to humans, especially young children, given that all pesticides are designed to kill or destroy living organisms. And the challenge that faces us is to use these chemicals effectively while preventing harm to human health, particularly our most vulnerable humans. I'm a nurse scientist who began my research career studying American veterans, so I want to talk about adults for a minute. I started my career looking at the chemicals that veterans were exposed to during the Vietnam War and the dangerous properties of Agent Orange. That was a herbicide that was used in the Vietnam War that has produced health effects that we still see in our veterans populations, and we're studying the children. Right now I'm on a National Academy of Medicine committee looking at the reproductive health effects of this dioxin Agent Orange exposure decades ago on the generations of children of Vietnam vets. So dioxin that contaminated this herbicide has been called the most toxic chemical known to man. And we sprayed tons of it in Vietnam without knowing what the effects were or even suspecting the health effects. And so we've throughout history have seen pesticides being used, and then decades later we discover what they've done to human health. I'll bring up an example of another pesticide and how science allowed us to see the effects of that chemical. During the 1950s, DDT was used and DDT was the first synthetic organic chemical used for mosquito control. And you can find advertisements from the 50s and 60s. DDT is good for me. It was promoted as really our weapon against polio. It was thought that it was safe for human exposure, and a decade later we became aware of how persistent DDT is in our environment. In fact, I would say everyone in this room has metabolites, residual evidence of being exposed to DDT. So we found out later how devastating it was to our wildlife, including the near extinction of our nation's bald eagle population. So that led, the effects on wildlife led to DDT being banned in the U.S. But with DDT started this era of chemical development for pest control. And during the 1950s and 60s, a large number of chemicals were used to control pests. And that brings us to organophosphates that were good for the environment because they could degrade very quickly, not persist like DDT, but you need to be aware that organophosphates, that science developed from highly toxic biological warfare agents like sarin and VX. So while they didn't remain in our environment, we didn't think they would have long-lasting effects, but we did know they were very, very toxic to the human brain. In fact, even today, more than 200,000 suicides are attributable to people ingesting pesticides like organophosphates. So please understand that we're talking about a very dangerous group of chemicals with substantial scientific data. And it's alarming that children today are still being exposed to these dangerous chemicals. So in addition to my work with veteran populations, I started studying children in agricultural communities. And during the last 2 decades, my work, along with that of others, have shown decades of scientific evidence of the effect of these organophosphate pesticides on children's health. And chlorpyrifos, better known as Lorstan or Durspan, is one of the most widely used organophosphates. There's no one disputing the scientific evidence in this area, and that children are the most susceptible to the dangers of this pesticide. And it's been linked with so many different health outcomes in children. And that's why in 2001 it was banned from residential use. And so, but today, chlorpyrifos is still being used in agricultural communities. And I just want you to think about this, that parents who work in fields where chlorpyrifos is sprayed bring that pesticide home on their shoes and their clothes. Pesticides drift to playgrounds, outside play areas of homes. Once these pesticides enter the home, we know they stay there. They're not degraded by the sun and rain and wind, and that they can remain on food. The residues can remain on food and children digest it. And that we know that children who live in these agricultural communities have more metabolites of chlorpyrifos in their bodies than children who don't live in agricultural communities. We're talking about 11 million children living in rural areas in the United States. So environmental protection of children requires making informed choices. And chlorpyrifos and organophosphate pesticides, the evidence is there, and continuing the use of chlorpyrifos will result in children suffering the effects of the exposure. I want to close with an example of a colleague of mine in Oregon who's very concerned about what they're going to do with new regulations around protecting agricultural workers. And the suggestion was made that agricultural families, when organophosphates like chlorpyrifos are being sprayed in their neighborhood fields, they could shelter in place while the spraying took place. That's what's going on in our country today. So thank you for the chance to talk to you and about this very important topic that's facing us.
All right, thank you, Dr. McCauley. Now we're going to have Dr. Adrienne Hollis, who is the Director of Federal Policy at WEACT, which is a community and environmental justice organization out of New York. She's a toxicologist and an environmental attorney, and she will talk about how current policy proposals affect people of color and low-income communities. Dr. Hollis? There you go.
Good morning. I'm a little taller, so. As Tracy said, I am the Director of Federal Policy at WEACT in the Washington, D.C. office. One of the things we do in that capacity is facilitate the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum on Climate Change, which is composed of about 40 organizations across the country whose role is designed to protect human health and the environment. WEACT's mission is to build healthy communities by ensuring that people of color and or low-income residents participate meaningfully in the creation of sound and fair environmental health and protection policies and practices. So what I'm going to be talking about today are just a couple of current legislations that are on the table or recently presented to us by this administration, and how it affects two communities that are one in which I live and one in which WEACT works. And those are the House Joint Resolution 36, which talks about methane regulations, And the executive order that President Trump signed last week on the 29th that was entitled to promote energy independence and economic growth, but essentially is sort of a rollback of the Clean Power Plan. So H.J.R. 36, House Joint Resolution 36, is a method for Congress to repeal the methane rule. And the methane rule was designed to lower the emissions of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and the like. So in that way, decreasing the amount of pollution that a community is exposed to. And what I didn't say is that when I talk about communities, I mean people of color, low socioeconomic status, vulnerable communities are very young and the very old, okay? So I wanted to give an example. I live in Prince George's County here in the DMV in Maryland. There, in Prince George's County, there are a number of health effects that have been reported, but I wanted to focus on Brandywine. I don't do any work there currently. Most of my data has been obtained just from research, others' work, especially the Energy Justice Network, which I encourage everybody to sort of check out. So Brandywine is an African-American community. It's about 7,000 residents. The entire Prince George's County has about 60% African-Americans. It's supposed to be one of the most affluent, well, the most affluent African-American county in the country. So this is really indicative of the fact that race is more of an indicator for environmental racism, environmental justice, than socioeconomic status. You know, a perfect example of that. So in Brandywine, it's just 21 square miles. It has one of the largest gas-fired power plants. Nearby in Eagle Harbor, which is in the southeastern corner of the county, there's an oil-burning power plant. A few months ago, not one, but two additional gas-fired power plants were approved to be built in the PG County. And in nearby Charles County, there's a gas-fired power plant. So in and of itself, we're talking about increased exposure, that now we have 5 gas and oil plants in a small area. It's crazy, because this area has already been designated as unacceptable air quality by EPA for ozone. So now not only do you have current ozone exposures, but you're increasing the amount of exposure by increasing the number of facilities in that area. So that is where I live. And then to talk about where WE Act works, the executive order that was signed last week that essentially rolls back the Clean Power Plan is important because through EPA's Clean Power Plan, environmental justice communities, communities of color, vulnerable communities have been able to engage in the state's development of its implementation plan as required under the CPP, this Clean Power Plan. So in that regard, the power plant has allowed us to have a seat at the table, which we're due anyway, because we're going to be the communities that are affected by, we are the communities that are first affected by climate change. And as was already said earlier, the very young are more susceptible, you know, for a variety of reasons. So in a perfect example of some of the effects of climate change, you've already heard about the urban heat island effect. There's a study in New York, in and around the community that WE Act participates in education and outreach activities with. So the urban heat island effect, if you don't know what it is, occurs when buildings and sidewalks and such absorb heat during the day and release it at night. And usually there are no shade areas available, no trees or whatever in those sorts of communities. So now you have exposure to extreme temperature conditions. In addition to that, I think Dr. Herrera mentioned severe weather events. Perfect example, Superstorm Sandy. I was in New Jersey at the time, but I know in New York, about 80,000 tenants were in 400 housing units were affected by that storm. And it's been estimated that it'll take 9 years before all repairs are made. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that impacts to children are of particular concern, as globally 1 in 4 deaths occur in children ages 1 to 5 years old due to air pollution and other preventable environmental factors. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And now we will have Dr. Jerry Paulson, who is the former Executive Committee Chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Environmental Health. Dr. Paulson has a long and deep experience in children's environmental health, science, and policy work, and he's a professor emeritus of pediatrics and environmental health and occupational health at George Washington University. So he's going to discuss how changes at EPA will affect children's health.
Thank you, Dr. Woodruff. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us. I think that this sign to my left that says, like healthy kids, save EPA, is the reason that we're all here with you this morning and we're talking about what we're talking about. I would also add, in spite of the fact that I'm a pediatrician and children always come first to my mind, that if you like healthy human beings, you will save the EPA. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has really, over the course of its existence since 1970, done many good things for human health. As I said, I'm a pediatrician. I did my house staff training in Baltimore, Maryland during the mid-1970s, and then I moved to be a faculty member at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. Both Cleveland and Baltimore were cities that had a lot of old, dilapidated housing and a lot of vehicular traffic that was burning leaded gasoline. I saw many children with very high blood lead levels in the 60 micrograms per deciliter range and above, which clearly by today's standards is 10 times what we often think about today. The situation with childhood lead poisoning has changed radically since, as a result of the regulations promulgated by EPA and other federal agencies. And in this graph, you can see the decline in the blood lead level and the different times that various ban on lead paint, phase out of lead and gasoline beginning, ban on lead in plumbing, and the marked decline in blood lead levels. This decline in blood lead levels was about 37% initially, and with subsequent lead regulations has gone down even further. Lead, nevertheless, remains a very important public health problem because slight changes in IQ have a huge population effect. A 5-point shift in IQ leads to a 57% increase in the population of individuals who have impaired intellect. So the country needs a strong EPA if it's ever to solve the problem of lead poisoning. The economic cost of lead poisoning is staggering. In a paper published in Health Affairs in 2011, Tresande and Liu identified nearly $6 million in medical care costs, as well as an additional nearly $51 billion in lost economic productivity as a result of the decline in cognitive levels of kids who've been exposed to lead. Part of the ongoing story of lead occurs in places like Flint, Michigan, East Chicago, Indiana, and numerous other places where lead still exists in old paint, in old pipes, and in the soil from old industries. We have to remember that part of EPA's budget is passed through to states and local governments to do work that they need to do to make the environment safe for kids. In the 2015 EPA budget as enacted, state and tribal assistance grants alone amounted to $3.5 billion out of an overall $8.1 million EPA budget, or basically about 43% of the EPA budget. About a third of all state funding for environmental regulations is supplied by the Environmental Protection Agency. So cutting the EPA budget will harm states and localities where the principles of federalism would say that the work should be done. In 2014, when there was a chemical spill in the Elk River in Charleston, West Virginia, I was the medical director for the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and the Environment, one of 10 such pediatric environmental health specialty units in the United States. And the Mid-Atlantic Center serves Federal Region 3, which includes West Virginia. I know from my experience over the weeks that this situation played out that there were many federal resources, including major time commitments from EPA staff, that were required to help West Virginia with the situation that, among other things, cut off drinking water for 300,000 residents in 9 counties. Schools and government offices and businesses closed. This type of situation is not one that states can manage on their own without their resources being supplemented by the federal government and the EPA. As I look forward to other problems that may arise as a result of slashing EPA budgets, I'm concerned that there will be a decrease in the agency's already limited ability to remediate toxic Superfund sites. Right now, parents and communities that I work with rely on a number of publicly available EPA data sets to help them plan community improvements, safer location of schools and recreation centers, and other facilities used by children. Cuts in the EPA budget will slow or eliminate the collection and dissemination of this information. As a pediatrician, I know that there's almost nothing that I can do to treat children who have been injured by environmental health hazards. There is no pill or potion that I can prescribe to repair lungs that have been damaged by air pollution, to correct the hormonal problems that may have been caused by endocrine disrupting chemicals. Environmental health is all about prevention, not treatment. EPA budget cuts will harm the health of children and adults and make the work of pediatricians and other health professionals more difficult. For safe and healthy children in the U.S. and around the world, we need a well-funded, well-staffed EPA that has robust regulatory and public information capacities.
All right, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful panel. Now we are going to open up questions to the audience, but we're first going to start with Nsé Witherspoon. I'd like to thank Nsé, who's the Executive Director of the Children's Environmental Health Network, who is our co-sponsor in this event. And I don't know if you want to say a few words before we get started with the questions.
Good morning. Excellent comments. And I'm even hearing from wonderful colleagues of how everyone really appreciated how you all presented this information. A lot of us have heard this in different ways, but thank you. But it was very well done, very well done. Thank you for all of your attendance. Just for a quick recap, we heard from Dr. Woodruff that she was reminding us about the serious vulnerabilities that children have to known environmental hazards and the incredible amount of peer-reviewed science that is available. If any of you would like to be connected to those, we're happy to do that. And also the co-benefits, the health and economic co-benefits are incredible, and there's no other comparison. So there are some huge takeaway points there. Dr. Pereira talked about the severity of the rollbacks of EPA and the rules and policies that will no doubt be implicated, especially among children and protecting children. We'll have less efficient cars, we'll have more pollution, more carbon production, and overall more harm to children. Very well said. Dr. McCauley talked at great length about pesticides and how they harm humans, not just pests, quote unquote, if you will. We are not out of that. And the atrocious examples of dioxin and DDT that we should be learning from. But yet we do know that chlorpyrifos also remains a current concern and widely used in our communities across the country. Dr. Hollis talked about race being more of an indicator to exposures than social economic status. And that in Southern Maryland communities where I live, Charles County as well, how we're dealing with some severe issues with coal-burning power plants, and we are no different than many communities across the country. We should not be increasing the use of those. We need to be rolling back for all of the examples and many more to come. And that the impacts to children are very concerning, that 1 in 4 deaths internationally are due to known air pollutants. That's huge. And finally, Dr. Paulson, very well said as well. If you support children or like humans, we should not be supporting these rollbacks to the EPA at all. That any slight changes in IQ will have serious impacts, some even say for our national defense, but certainly huge implications to our community as a whole every time we're reducing the IQ of our current and future children. Air pollution has a direct impact on our economy. That was huge. That states and local governments will certainly suffer greatly. And with this administration talking so much about giving jurisdiction and support to states, that totally goes against that point. And that healthcare professionals cannot treat the atrocities as a result of known air pollutants and exposures, the known exposures that we have to children. And we don't want healthcare professionals to be treating. Again, we want to be focusing on prevention. So I heard the president talk this week to a room of CEOs, and again, talked a lot about how, in the same sentence, how we don't want all the regulations on you, we're gonna roll back those regulations, but also we care and will work to protect air and water. You cannot do both. You cannot cut the already reduced capacity of the Environmental Protection Agency and all that its mission means for public health, current and future, and also talk about wanting to support and having a strong protection of our air and our water. So again, I want to thank all of you. We're literally just across the street. If any of your offices want to learn more about some of these issues, along with any of us here in our vast networks, we're happy to be there for you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yes, right here.
Panel, thank you so much. My name is Trish Koman. I'm coming from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm a small business owner, Green Barn Research Associates. I really appreciate the remarks today. Coming from the Great Lakes area, where water is such a precious resource for us, and yet we have situations such as in Toledo, where hospitals are not able to get water and the community is not able to get water, and of course from Flint and their water issues. I'm very concerned about these cuts. EPA plays a key role in leadership with states and in assessing the science. And Dr. Paulson, I'm curious, you mentioned that EPA plays a key role in reviewing some of the science regarding harmful neurotoxins like lead that puts children at risk. And you also described a bit about how EPA creates data sets that can make the science more accessible and help communities. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how EPA does that.
The EPA collects quite a bit of data from businesses, from state and local governments, from some of its own monitoring systems around the country. And collecting that data is all well and good, and it's very important, and scientists can use it sort of as it is and as it comes in to the EPA. But one of the very important things that the Environmental Protection Agency does is to format that data into data sets that are usable by the community. There's a data set known, for example, as the Toxic Release Inventory, or TRI. And there are geographic information systems that individuals and communities, such as EnviroMapper, you can go to EnviroMapper, put in your zip code, and get all sorts of information about air, water, industrial pollution that is in your community. None of that data would be readily available. It would take a tremendous amount of effort for any member of the general population, or even somebody like myself who's, relatively sophisticated, but I'm not a data manipulator. If I had to get air pollution data about where I live in Alexandria, I'm going to use EnviroMapper. If I want information on industries in the state of Virginia, I'm going to go to the TRI data. So having these data sets is just absolutely essential. The collection of the data needs to continue. The formatting of the data so that it can be used by community members needs to continue.
Thank you. Yes, there's another question here.
Pat Pizzuto, Bloomberg DNA.
Uh-huh.
I'm curious, the amount of the cuts proposed to the agency are about 2/3 cut to the Office of the Administrator that addresses children and other sensitive populations to guide throughout the work done throughout the agency, and it also proposes to eliminate the lead risk reduction program. how would those types of cuts affect kids?
So I will start, and then we can work across the panel. So first of all, the agency has, their responsibility is to carry out the laws that are passed by Congress and signed by the president. And so in order to do that, they need to have the staff to, as Jerry said, collect the data, because if you don't have information, for example, about air pollution, you can't actually evaluate whether it's what the levels are, whether you're in compliance with the laws, or whether they're harming different populations. The Children's Health Office was formed because they help provide the expertise to the other parts of the agency about how to address children's health risks when you're looking at different regulatory programs, whether it's air pollution, the implementation of TSCA, water, et cetera. So they have that expertise that is necessary because you need to understand how are different pollutants going to affect children's health, what are the implications for different options that the agency is considering in terms of their regulatory, when they're implementing different types of regulatory standards. So children's health is very important. The other thing that's also been proposed in those budget cuts is zeroing out of the research program. And the reason we know, so here's something actually that I think is important to remember, is that children in the United States, chronic health conditions are going up, right? So we have increased obesity, diabetes. There was a big increase in asthma, which actually is a little bit leveled off, neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and ADHD, and they have been going up rapidly over the last 20 to 30 years. There is some type of environmental influence on these children's health outcomes, and if we don't look at the role of environmental contaminants on children's health, we are going to be essentially, that could be our missing link for so many of these different children's health outcomes. But we only really have studied a fraction of the chemicals that are out in the environment. And so EPA's investment in this helps them, give them the information so they can make the best decisions to protect children's health. So would other people like to answer on this too?
I think that is so compelling. And Jerry's graph of the story of lead, imagine if we hadn't had EPA. Would he have been able to tell that story and show the value of environmental protection? And so imagine if we could have a robust EPA who could tell the good stories, that if indeed is this flattening out of asthma, could it be related to our doing things environmentally? If you decrease the funding of EPA, the ability to actually recognize, quantify, and describe the value of environmental protection will go away. And I think all the citizens of the world need to have access to not just the bad things we're doing to the environment, but the great stories that emerge when we protect and clean up our environment.
I think, Ricky, did you want to say something?
Yes. I would say that critical role of EPA is to fund and utilize and act upon science knowledge about the relationships between environmental exposures and harm, illness, developmental impairment in children and in the general population. And without that function, we would not, as has been said, have the health of children that we have today, albeit it needs improving. There are so many examples of where EPA's actions have benefited health in New York, and actions of other government agencies utilizing science that was in fact funded by EPA and NIEHS jointly. In New York City, we have seen the levels of pollution coming down as we've monitored them in the small backpack monitors of women worn during pregnancy, coming down in corresponding to policies that have been initiated to reduce air pollution sources. And in fact, EPA's ban, effective phase out, but ban of chlorpyrifos for residential use resulted in a very apparent drop, sharp drop in the levels of that pesticide in cord bloods of the children who had been enrolled in our study. So the children before the ban had much higher levels. After the ban, almost no one had high levels of chlorpyrifos. So benefits that can be seen immediately and that are critical.
Yes, Jerry?
Whether one goes to nursing school or medical school, every health professional, the first time that you encounter children during your health profession's education, the first thing that people say to you is, kids are not little adults, meaning all the education you've had up to date, not really forget about it, but be prepared to think very differently. Kids' metabolism are different, kids' behaviors are different. And so to your question about the Office of Children's Health Protection, the Environmental Protection Agency needs a nidus of information to help the rest of the agency, a nidus of expertise to help the rest of the education, the rest of the agency to wrestle with the very difficult problems about, okay, we want to protect Americans from the adverse health effects of pesticide X or chlorpyrifos, for example. If you use a model of an adult to make decisions on how to protect them, you will not end up protecting children. So the loss or the severe cuts in the Office of Children's Health Protection would significantly and adversely affect the EPA's ability to protect children specifically from environmental health hazards.
Yes, of course.
Another point, EPA's role in protecting us against climate change, from which children suffer the most. Worldwide, 88% of the health impacts of climate change are borne by children 0 to 5 years of age. Those measures, policies, rules that EPA has put in place to deal with this problem, to mitigate the problem, are badly, badly needed. This is not an abstraction. Climate change is not some future threat. It is happening now. It's happening in our cities, in our rural areas. We're seeing the impacts. And so those cuts and rollbacks will be devastating, both immediately and in the long term.
Yes, over there.
Good morning. My name is Kristen Schaefer. I'm with Pesticide Action Network, and I want to thank you for the fabulous panel. I really appreciated the presentations. So we've been tracking carefully the pushing EPA for many years to take action on chlorpyrifos, together with our colleagues at NRDC who are here, many others across the country. And so clearly we're disappointed and somewhat stunned by the decision made last week by the agency to reverse course on the pending ban. And to us, it really shows a very clear the agency is turning its back on scientific, evidence-based decision-making. That combined with the cuts that seem to specifically target science and research, not just at EPA, but in other agencies as well. Some folks are calling this a war on science. So my question for you all is what do you see as the role of the scientific community in pushing back against this war on science, and how can advocacy groups like ours and citizens across the country support you?
Well, I'd like to answer that because we have been talking a lot about that at University of California, San Francisco. We have actually, UCSF has been engaged in helping scientists stand up to talk about science. We've had 2 events at UCSF, one bringing together a panel of scientists to talk about your responsibilities and your roles to talk about your science in public venues and to policymakers, and to talk about your science, not to advocate on behalf of having good science. And we've also had 2 workshops at UCSF on how do you come and talk to people in Washington, D.C. about your science. So I think we're seeing a lot more activity among scientists because it's hard to, at this panel we had at UCSF, it was, and it's actually live streamed, so people can go and look at it on UCTV, and I would recommend it to everyone because we had an excellent panel of scientists at UCSF who had all stood up for their science and received some pushback, everything from tobacco to sugar science to HIV work. So it's very compelling stories about what it's like to share your science in sometimes not very comfortable settings. But I think the thing that was really interesting was it is a little unsettling to talk about the anti-fact world. This is not news because it has been discussed by the administration, but it's like, I don't think that's not a good way to make decisions. And if you do not base your information on science, that doesn't mean the decision you make doesn't take into other factors, but you will make bad decisions, and those bad decisions can hurt people. So that's why we need science, not because we think science, of course we think science is great because we're scientists, but also because it helps us make the best decisions to help people so that we can improve health. Really, that's what we're talking about here is we care about health, we care about children's health because they're so vulnerable, and that's why we need the science to uncover what we know about the environment and children's health so that we can take actions to prevent them from being sick. Yeah, Ricky.
With respect to chlorpyrifos, there is a large body of laboratory evidence, human epidemiological data that is consistent in pointing to neurodevelopmental impacts in children, in the young, from exposure to this pesticide. There was a letter signed, I believe, in January of this year by 45 scientists and health professionals talking about supporting the EPA proposal to revoke tolerances for chlorpyrifos. And it was very well thought through and presents the data, a good review of the data. So I would suggest you can look at that online if you want to read that. Thank you.
Yes, Linda.
So I would say that never before have we seen the importance of research community partnerships. Because let's face it, if we're living in a world where everything is fake facts, even reputable science is degraded, but what cannot be erased is the stories from the communities. And we saw it with the Affordable Care Act. What turned the United States, and is still turning the United States around support for the Affordable Care Act, is not the data, it's not the science, it's the stories of people that are impacted by rolling back regulations or laws. And what's great about EPA is they've been in the forefront of the partnerships of researchers and communities. And so we have to do our work with our scientific community, absolutely, but we can't do this without our community partners. Absolutely have to be able to tell the stories.
Yeah, I would also add too, just in terms of your question and your point is it really speaks to the importance of us being engaged, scientists, community, other partners engaged in this because, EPA is obviously they're a part of the administration, and if they will make decisions that may not be, that are not based on science, and that we need to be there advocating on behalf of the science or working with other partners to influence those, because there's 3 branches of government so far. So there are, and they should, checks and balances, and we need to engage on that because in the end we want EPA to be advocates of good science, good decision-making, and protecting people's health. Yes, Ricky and Linda and Adrienne?
Oh, I'm going to be very brief. I think Adrienne will.
Adrienne?
Okay, so on this issue of partnerships with the community, between scientific researchers and the community, absolutely critical. And our center, Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health, has had a partnership since 1998 with West Harlem Environmental Action, We Act, Dr. Hollis's organization, without which we could not have advanced the science or the translation of science to inform policymakers about what they need to know.
Adrienne, did you want to say something? Yeah. I
Yes.
don't know. Yes.
In addition to the very important partnership that Dr. Pereira was talking about, the science itself is very important to communities because in the past, communities have historic information about issues, about exposures, pathways, things that normally scientists don't think about, but that data hasn't been accepted by, in the normal course of things. But when you have scientists who have data that back that up, that's very important. And communities have to step up, and they actually are stepping up to sort of talk about how important that information is and how important that extra support is, because even though we're pushing for more community science, or for it to be accepted on a higher level, you still need that support from the scientific community. And I'm not just saying it as a scientist, but I do recall the frustration I had as an academician in putting forth data that a community organization had gathered, because you don't get that sort of, what's the word I'm looking, you don't get that sort of support for it or acceptance of it as you would from a scientist. So it's very important, and we are watching the budget cuts in that regard for that reason.
Thank you. Excellent. I'm sorry, was there somebody else who had a question? I think I saw, no? Because we're almost at time anyway. Well, this is marks the end of the hour, so I'd like to thank everyone for attending. People are here and available for questions after the panel. I'd like to thank everybody who's live streaming it, and we will be making the video publicly available so you can share it with your colleagues or using it as a teaching instrument. I would also just reiterate, too, we have other material, video and other types of materials available about this topic, including the event that we had at UCSF about speaking up about your science. That's available on our websites, and we have information about that in the back. So thank you very much.
Taking that question and taking it further.